Hello and welcome to the Stone and Chalk webinar event, Embracing ChatGPT and AI in Risk Management. We're excited to get underway now with our AI expert and host, Ben Dunn. So Ben, it's over to you.
Thank you very much. Okay, I think I have you for an hour. I try to get through my slides in 45 minutes and usually fail. So I'm going to get through the slides. Usually takes me about 50 minutes because there's a fair few slides, and then there's some Q&A at the end. If you would like to ask questions during the webinar, we will sort of collect and collate them, and we'll go through whatever we can at the end. Okay, so let me just begin by introducing Stone and Chalk. Stone and Chalk is an innovation ecosystem company. We run co-working spaces in 4 different hubs across Australia. We have 250 startups and about 6,000 residents. And we are here to transform Australia into a sustainable tech-driven economy. I work in the advisory team, and in the advisory team, we help companies to leverage tech disruption like generative AI, help companies to partner with startups, and lately we've started building products like private GPTs, and I'll get to that later. On the chat, we have Kim Jolly, who's a member of my team, and she will be able to answer any questions that you have during the chat that we're not keeping for the end for Q&A. Okay, so who is today for? One of the issues with a webinar like this is that one never knows the different levels of people who are turning up in terms of how much knowledge people have of AI. And equally, there's no way for you to express it like sort of judo belts as to, you know, what stage you're at. So what today is for is it's not for beginners, as in people who've never ever used ChatGPT. We do assume a certain level of knowledge. Neither is it for experts, because there are data scientists who sign up for these webinars, and whilst they are very welcome, I'm hoping they're going to treat this as a holiday to see how the other half live, because I'm certainly not a data scientist. Who this is for is the people in the middle. It's the people who are curious about AI. You have used it, and you want to know how to apply it in your job. In terms of risk, the title of this is AI for Risk Professionals, and clearly that is a very, very wide field. I think we had somebody from the military ask us yesterday what time things were on, and logistical questions. What I'm going to do today is to focus primarily on the financial services kind of aspect of risk, and even then within that, talking much more around credit risk and operational risk, so less about market liquidity risk. And so that means the 3 lines of defense, the kind of things that operational risk people, and no doubt most people in financial services, are aware of. Just so you know, my background is financial services. You can check me out on LinkedIn. I spent 12 years in HSBC. My first job was running a remittance department in Sri Lanka, where I was audited. And then my second job was trade finance operations, when I was audited again. And after both of those, they concluded I wasn't really very good at operations, and so they stopped doing that, which was a blessing for all of us. So what I'm going to do today is kind of like the old film, The Karate Kid. And for those of you who are not familiar with this film, Ralph Macchio, who's the actor there, who apparently is now in his 60s, he was getting beaten up by kids, and so he went to this gentleman on the right, who said that he would teach him how to do karate. But when he went over there, he spent the first week waxing cars, waxing on and then waxing off, and then the second week painting a fence with that kind of motion and then that kind of motion, and he got really frustrated. And at the end of that time, he went back to the teacher and he said, I don't know anything about karate. But then what happened is he discovered that the muscle memory that he'd created by waxing on and waxing off and painting fences was actually all he needed to know in order to execute any number of karate moves. So that's what we're going to do today. I'm going to talk to some principles of how to use generative AI. I am going to apply it to something that is a kind of a use case. And I'm going to talk towards the end around what I believe are the implications or potential scenarios for the way that risk might be managed in the future. Over the weekend, there was a really great article in the FT. It was an interview with this guy, Ted Chiang, and he quoted something on Twitter where apparently somebody said, what is artificial intelligence? And someone else said, a poor choice of words in 1954, meaning that artificial intelligence is nothing of the sort. What it actually is applied statistics. And I will come to this a little bit later, but it is important to understand that this is not intelligence in the way that we understand it. There's no meaning. It doesn't, even though it might look like it's kind of thinking and talking like us, that's not the way it works. So today, my 3 key messages. First of all, generative AI changes the way we work at a very fundamental level. Secondly, generative AI should lead to better risk management, much better, I believe. And thirdly, there are significant opportunities available to early adopters, and that's where you need to be. There's a lot of our clients where IT departments are just shutting everything down and stopping everybody doing anything. And I can completely understand where they're coming from in terms of a risk perspective. But at the same time, as I'll come to in a moment, this is a very ubiquitous, democratizing, empowering technology that you can use in your personal life as much as you can in your work life. And so I would encourage everybody on this call, first of all, to subscribe to ChatGPT, and second of all, to experiment as much as you can, whether that's at work or at home. So the first thing, let's talk about generative AI and how it's changing the way that we work. First thing, which is the really good news, is that this time the technology has been built for normal people. So that means that you don't need to know any code, you don't need to know any kind of special language. You just talk to it in the way that you would talk to anyone. In this case, an intern. I'll get to that in a minute. Secondly, there's an awful lot of stuff just recently in the press about how this is going to be the end of the world. And there is no doubt that there are risks. However, when we're thinking about it in this sense, I'm not going to go through today the risk of AI in that sense, okay? What I'm doing is Jarvis, not Skynet. So if you're wanting the Skynet presentation, that's somebody else. Secondly is that there is a wonderful expression about, it's the rising tide that floats all boats. And I believe that's exactly what generative AI is, to the point where if you're not using it, you're at a significant disadvantage. And secondly, what it does is it turns everybody into supermen, because it raises, or superwomen, it raises the minimum level that everybody can achieve. So why all the fuss? Because, this has been something before. Every time, Web3 or blockchain, that was the last time we were told it was going to change everything. Obviously, Apple launched Vision Pro yesterday. I think that probably will change everything. But what is it about generative AI? So the first thing is we have seen warp speed adoption. So there's the adoption in terms of Instagram and Spotify. ChatGPT took 5 days to get to 1 million users. But why is that? Fundamentally, it's because there's no infrastructure needed. There's nothing new. There's no device that anybody has to buy like the Vision Pro. There's no wires that have to be laid. There's no pipes. Everybody who has a smartphone, and that's 6.6 billion people on the planet, conceivably has access to generative AI and everything that it can do for them. That said, not everybody is using it in the best possible way. So Chris, good Lord, I've forgotten his name. Anyway, Chris from Andreessen Horowitz, he, on a recent podcast, he talked about, Chris Dixon, he talked about skeuomorphism, which is basically where you take a new technology and you apply it in old ways, and you don't necessarily understand what the technology can bring, or you don't question the assumptions of the old ways and how the new technology changes that. So for instance, when TV cameras and broadcast TV was first launched, what they would do is to take broadcast cameras and put them on a fixed tripod and point them at a theater stage. Because what they hadn't realized is that they can move the thing around, they can zoom in, they can do close-ups, all of those kind of things. That would be an example of skeuomorphism. Equally, when radio first came out, broadcast radio, they would read the newspaper over the radio because they hadn't questioned that assumption. Now, according to Goldman Sachs, who issued a report in February, March time, they believe that 1/4 of current work tasks could be automated by AI in the US and Europe. They also talked about impact and how 44% of legal jobs were going to be impacted. clearly these things do tend to be written in terms of kind of getting newspaper inches. So just because a current work task could be automated, there's parts of everybody's job that we all wish could be automated. And that's the point here, which is that it's not that your job is going to be automated away, but as Rob Thomas from IBM recently said, AI might not replace managers, but the managers that use AI will replace the managers that do not. So our first poll question: are you currently using generative AI in your risk management role at your company? So secondly, in the Financial Times recently, there was a quote: the productivity gains from AI will be earned by whoever has the wit or motivation to deploy them. That means there is so much to be said by just starting. ChatGPT can teach you how to use ChatGPT. There's any number of other GPTs like Bing, Google Bard, which are now being launched for free. I would urge everybody to just experiment, just start. You will lose nothing and you will gain an enormous amount. Now, once upon a time, when I was working for Daisy, which is an AI startup who build software for contact centers. In 2018, there was a big difference between unstructured and structured data. Unstructured being the kind of stuff, audio or photos, and structured data in spreadsheets. One of the big differences with generative AI and large language models is that that's no longer the big deal that it used to be. And therefore, all of the kind of the efforts that have gone into structuring data are worthwhile, but it doesn't stop there. You don't have to have all your data in a structured form in order to train an algorithm. Fundamentally, though, the role of AI is going to be increasing the productivity of knowledge workers. And in terms of coding assistants or assistants with a CE, software developers have had a co-pilot in GitHub, which is a database that coders use. And there has been a coding assistant available since September last year from Microsoft. And now there's something like, I think it's 49% of code on GitHub is AI generated. And the research shows that the time to complete that coding task on the graph on the left-hand side, when an AI is involved, is reduced by 55%. That's augmentation. And yes, it's back to that kind of what I said before about the Goldman Sachs thing. There's 44% of tasks have been automated, or a large percentage, whatever that math is. But that's okay, because what that has meant is that developers are that much more productive. In terms of the way that AI works, it's a very, very different way of talking to computers or coding computers to the way it used to be. So once upon a time, if we think about the example of autonomous cars, one of the issues that autonomous cars have is that they need to be programmed with all of the different ways, all of the different scenarios, all the different things that can happen to a car when it's driving down a street. And therefore, there is no way that you can use the if this, then that type approach to programming that coding always has, because you can't anticipate all of the scenarios that might happen. Plus, there is no way that a computer can be fast enough to go through all of the millions of lines of codes and the millions of lines of scenarios to find the one that means that they don't knock over this person on the road. So the way that autonomous driving now works is much more around probabilities. We actually kind of train the system to understand how we drive, and then it works based on probabilities that says, what would a driver do in this particular case? And then it acts. So that's very, very different from lines of code and if this, then that. That said, one of my favorite analysts in this area is a guy called Ben Evans. He said, large language models do not answer questions. They create things that look like answers to questions, that look like your question. Now, one of the things that you can try yourself, put in your name and your job and where you live, and ask ChatGPT to write a biography for you. And you will see that what it comes out with is not precisely your biography. What it will come out with is something that sounds like something someone like you might do. Because if you then ask it to do it again, you repeat the exercise, it will come out with something completely new and separate. Not completely, but it will come out with something because it's based on probabilities. And that's why you can end up with these things that you may have heard about, which is called hallucinations. Now, this is a very, this is something that certainly lawyers and accountants and risk professionals need to bear in mind, because a lot of the time you are dealing with facts, and the facts become really, really key when dealing with generative AI. Because if it is hallucinating, that's a big problem. There was a case that you may have read about last week in New York, where a lawyer called Stephen Schwartz was losing a case. And so he asked ChatGPT to write an opinion for him to be able to give to the judge. It came out with a 10-page opinion, which seemed pretty good to Stephen. And when he handed it to the prosecution, they were looking for all of the cases that this thing had quoted and couldn't find any of them. And then Stephen had to admit that he'd done it with ChatGPT and that there was absolutely no fact in there whatsoever, but it looked pretty good. It sounded pretty good. The judge wasn't pleased. So generative AI has a wide range of applications. And in terms of my 2x2, these are the kind of things that it can do when you're sort of dealing with these axes, complex and simple, and operational versus strategic. But you need to stay away from facts unless it really is connected to a database. Something that ChatGPT launched in March was what they called plugins. And those plugins created a tunnel through which ChatGPT could interrogate a database like Kayak, like Expedia. And with OpenAI, they have their own plugins, like a browser plugin that enables ChatGPT to actually browse the web, the live web, and come back with proper answers, or to interrogate. They have a thing called a code interpreter, which also allows you to upload a spreadsheet, and it will create all sorts of analysis based on that data that you've given it. So if ChatGPT is given access to a database in some form, whether that's a plugin or a private GPT, and we'll come to that a little bit later, that's the case in which the facts do actually become reliable. In which case the ChatGPT becomes a user interface through a natural language interface where you can use just natural sentences to ask it questions. So generative AI leads to better risk management, which I'm aware is a big statement. So let's see how. So first of all, how can AI help with risk? I'm not going to kind of go through everything on this slide because I do go through it in following slides. But essentially, it's the routine stuff, right? It can summarize, it can explain complex concepts, and we'll come to that in terms of an example use case in a moment. But critically, what can't AI do? And this is where the human augmentation comes in. Because things like judgment, that whole thing about good judgment comes from experience and experience comes from bad judgment. You can try and train an algorithm with judgment, but that becomes very difficult to nail down. Equally, in terms of ethical considerations and deep understanding of context, these are the things that humans would bring to any transaction or any situation. So these are the kind of things that AI can't do, but there's a big caveat with all of this stuff, because anybody who pays any attention to AI sees how much this is progressing over time. And therefore, there always has to be this rider that says yet, because before you know it, this thing will have developed. And that's another reason why you need to be starting, because this is kind of like the opposite of a wasp. With a wasp, they say it won't sting you if you just ignore it. If you ignore it, this thing will sting you. So how should you use GPT? At the moment, the best way to describe GPT's level in terms of what it can do and what it can't do is you should treat it as if it were an intern. Give it time and it will be a lot more than an intern. But right now, You can ask it to do something, it will come back to you, and it remembers the conversation. There is some persistence there. So it will come back to you with its response. You can then give it feedback, and you can say, yeah, like that, but shorter, or like that, but stop writing a letter. So there's any number of ways that you can do it. So you can give it feedback and it will come back and forth. It will work with you. Okay, so you should be treating it like an intern. So our second poll, are you worried about generative AI's impact on the risk management industry? Now, in terms of ChatGPT, back in November last year, there was just ChatGPT from OpenAI. And then over time, we've seen more and more of these kind of GPT-based systems come out. And what's interesting is, as you would expect, all of them are kind of differentiating in slightly new ways. So in terms of, obviously with Bing, it's kind of folded into Microsoft, and the same with Google Bard, folded into Google. What's interesting about something like Perplexity, first of all, Perplexity started life as a mobile app, so you can get that on a mobile basis. But now one of the key features that Perplexity introduces is that it will cite sources. And the co-pilot that is referenced there under upgrades and options, it comes back and it asks you questions about the prompt that you put in before it gives you the final answer. And then Anthropic is really interesting. At the moment, there's a wait list for their bot called Claude. But what's really interesting about them is that the attachment size, the size of the document that you can upload, is 75,000 words, which is much larger than any of the other generative AI bots. And that will become really important a little bit later on. So I was listening to Reid Hoffman's excellent podcast, Possible, and he was interviewing a lady from Microsoft who works in the Future of Work team. And she talked about something that they are bringing out imminently, she said. Now, obviously, this is Zoom, this isn't Teams, but work with me. What she said is that they are going to integrate GPT into Teams in a way that means that GPT will be listening to the meeting, listening to the conversation. And then on that right-hand side, it will then be providing suggestions that only you can see. So that might be a suggestion in terms of diversity implications. It could be a reminder, some research that it's gone off and found. It might come back with sentiment analysis about people within the meeting and how, you know, so-and-so has been silent for a while. Or it could be some coaching for you, and that could be professional coaching in terms of your professional risk, or it could be coaching in terms of your behavior within the meeting. Oh, there we go. So let's talk about prompts, because at the moment, prompts are the way that we interact with AI, and prompts are a really, really important part of that interaction and getting that correct. So back to that skeuomorphism I mentioned earlier, what a prompt is not is a Google search query. So initially, everybody, including myself, when I was faced with the ChatGPT screen, I put in something that I would put into Google. You know, you tell me what the weather is, that kind of stuff. And it will return, you know, it will tell you the answer, but it can do so much more than that. And that's why there's something to be said for experimenting with it. And I'll give you some links right at the end to some of the newsletters that I get, which are helping me to understand everything that's possible with prompts. Because here's the problem. Just like you can go out and you can buy the same typewriter as Ernest Hemingway, but that doesn't mean that you're going to write like Ernest Hemingway. It's just a typewriter, right? And it's exactly the same with GPT. Because fundamentally what you're faced with when you go into GPT is this screen. So there's no buttons, there's no dials. It's not even as helpful as Excel, where it's kind of prompting you with kind of formulae that you could use. And so it's up to you as to what you ask it for. So what I've done is to kind of, in order to illustrate my 2x2, where I had explain and imagine and things like that, what I've done is I've tried to take a case study, an example of a case study where this is a real thing, where FinCEN have come up with a new anti-money laundering regulation. And they sent out the notification. So what I've done is to kind of imagine what would happen if there was a change in regulation, and how a risk professional might use GPT in that scenario. So the first thing, I might want to understand exactly what the regulation is trying to get at. So one of the things I can do is to ask ChatGPT to explain that regulation as if I were a 5-year-old. And you know, you'll have to forgive the, you know, mummy and daddy, you love each other very much type approach that it tends to take. But it does give a really simple and correct explanation. And it's correct because you've given it some facts from which to explain it. Okay. Secondly, you can say, well, okay, 5-year-old, bit basic. Give me what you would, how you would explain it to a university student studying finance, and off it goes. Then you might say, summarize that regulation in 100 words, just so I've got something that, you know, I can continually cut and paste and I can keep on putting on in emails when people ask me. Then you might say, okay, I'm the head of risk and compliance for a small bank in Texas called Dunn Bank. Write a briefing for the CEO on this new regulation. The CEO is not a risk professional, so explain the new regulation in commercial terms. And there it is on the right-hand side. I should say, by the way, this session will be available on YouTube. And so if you want to stop at any time and kind of read through the bits on the right-hand side, you can do that. But take it from me, what it's done on about halfway through is it says, in commercial terms, these regulations could impact us in several ways. And then it talks about that. So that's the CEO. Then write a compliance policy for the same bank, notifying the appropriate teams, the recent regulatory change, and providing specific actions they should take. So again, there's the key points. Then you've got immediate actions underneath, and it's identified the teams below there, right? Which I had to cut off because I don't have the space. Then you can say to it, which compliance policies and teams would this likely impact in Dunn Bank? Now, obviously, Dunn Bank is made up, so it doesn't know what compliance policies there are because I didn't write to them. But this is an example where it has imagined what someone like Dunn Bank might have in terms of its compliance policies. So these are the things that it's the compliance policies that it's suggesting that you change. You can upload the compliance policies and give it something to base it on, in which case it would be much more fact-based, but not in this particular case. So I just wanted to highlight that. Interestingly, at the end, you'll see for the different teams, what it's got is kind of a little sort of one-liner as to how it will kind of impact all of them. And then I've imagined a frontline mortgage broker for Dunn Bank. It says, I'm not a risk professional, but explain what I need to do differently as a result of this new regulation. And off it goes. Then I've imagined the same mortgage broker who says, I have a property transaction where the customer wants to buy a $5 million home. So this mortgage broker wants to know what they have to do differently with this particular transaction. So whether it's a mortgage broker, or it could be a corporate banker, or anybody who you deal with in terms of the front line, what they can use ChatGPT for is to interrogate this particular regulation or any other regulations, particularly if the GPT has been trained on the relevant regulations for their job. And we'll come to that a little bit later in terms of building specific GPTs, which means that you're dealing with the proper facts. And then, of course, if a frontline person can do that, the bad actors can do the same thing. So imagine 5 ways, 5, 10, 15, however many you want. Imagine ways in which a fraudster might try to evade this regulation, or at least a bad actor. And there you go. It's got a list of how somebody might evade those regulations, which I realize is a really big deal. And then I asked it to imagine the structure of a course. If I was to put together a course, what would that look like? So essentially, you can imagine for anything, any kind of change in regulation or any regulation for that matter, you can ask ChatGPT to break down everything that everybody needs to know within your organization. And you can do that on a regular basis. And you can do that at speed and volume. So you can provide everybody in your organization with a very specific profile as to what these things mean for them and their job. And I think that's the major kind of implication, is kind of essentially sort of hyper-personalization of the application of these kind of regulations. And I'll talk about that a little bit later on. I also tried something that I thought I'd kind of talk to you about, where I took Stone and Chalk's purpose, which is transforming Australia into a sustainable tech-driven economy, as I said earlier. And so I asked it to describe a future where that is the case. And you can see on the right-hand side, it did that. By 2050, Australia has transformed into a sustainable tech-driven powerhouse. And then it talks about what that looks like, right? Then I said, based on that, describe the role that Stone and Chalk played. And then after that, what strategy did Stone and Chalk follow? And then after that, describe the organizational structure required by Stone and Chalk to deliver this strategy. So that means that you can kind of take what is essentially a vision statement, a very, very short sentence, and ask ChatGPT to extrapolate or to reverse engineer back from that initial statement into something which is a lot more actionable and practical. Now, I should say, all of these things are just suggestions, okay? I came across an anaesthetist a couple of weeks ago who puts in the details, obviously not the name of the patient, but puts in the details of an operation they're about to do and just asks for suggestions as to the anesthetic he should use. And it comes up with suggestions. And sometimes he's tried the things that have come out, right? That's not from a medical ChatGPT, that's just from ChatGPT. Now, obviously, he's not going to kind of follow that slavishly, but what ChatGPT is doing is kind of augmenting him. It is providing some level of assistance to him. And that's what anybody can do, you know, risk professionals or frontline people, anybody can, and I think should do, in order to make risk and regulatory compliance part of the everyday. So the good news is that GPT can now prompt itself. The fact is that it always could prompt itself. It's just, it took an awful lot of experimentation by the 100 million people who have logged on to ChatGPT to discover all of the things that it could do. And just watching Twitter, in terms of kind of all of the people on there who come on and they show all of their experiments and what they've done, it is utterly fascinating. And so here you can see, I want you to help me create a great prompt so you can provide the best output for me. I'd like you to execute the following steps, and you give it the prompts, the following steps, and then it will come back and it will ask you these questions in order to provide a more precise prompt so that you get the right output first time. And then there's a really good news, which is something called AutoGPT, which was actually created by somebody who couldn't even code with ChatGPT. And this is the idea, and you can see here, again, you're going to get bored of this, but you'll get the message. I've put in a goal, which is how can Australia be transformed into a tech-driven economy? You can see that at the bottom. And then everything that appears above on the right-hand side, where it says current tasks, it's taken that goal and it's split them down into subtasks. And then in the middle, the main part, you can see it's thinking, and what it's doing is it's showing it's working. It's showing, because for each of these subtasks on the right-hand side, it goes off and addresses a different GPT with that subtask and comes back with the answer and puts that in the middle of the screen. So that means that you can just give it one single goal, and then it will go off and interrogate multiple GPTs in order to come back to you with the right answer. So there's Agent GPT. There's another one called rather fantastically God Mode, which I think we all would want. So in putting this presentation together, I've talked to a couple of friends and relatives who are in the risk business for different banks. And it was my sister who actually said, you know, we've got an 800-page manual. And in a sense. Nobody's expected to read all 800 pages, and yet they're audited as if they have. And so it becomes really difficult. It becomes kind of impractical. But you can imagine with ChatGPT, that's no longer the case. If you upload all 800 pages into ChatGPT, because all of a sudden that becomes the corpus, that becomes the fact that GPT is able to respond using that data. So any question you ask it, like if you're that frontline mortgage broker, you know, tell me any regulations that I need to be abiding by. Here's that big list. And then the mortgage broker might say, here's my transaction. What do I need to do in order to make that compliant? And if that 800 pages is being kept up to date, that's going to be something where that mortgage broker is going to get a very precise and specific response every time they actually want to do something operationally. So you can imagine, in terms of kind of, you might have the 800-page thing on the left-hand side, and then different people, different financial conduct authorities, whether that's the European one, the States, or anywhere else, every time that they issue a new regulation and you're updating your 800 pages or whatever the equivalent is, and then just like in my use case, you've explained it, you've written the new policies, you've imagined, you know, what that might look like for different kind of parties. Whether you're the risk professional, whether you're the team, or whether you're asking about specific transactions, what you can do is you can ask GPT, how does this new regulation or this change in regulations, how does that change everything in terms of all of my transactions? What do I have to do in terms of all of my teams? Where are the big issues? What does the training course have to look like? So it becomes something that used to be completely and utterly impractical because of just the sheer volume, and just nobody has the time, never mind the just sheer intellectual heft to be able to imagine all of that for the individuals within an organization. So you actually end up with something that looks a lot like the Matrix. So not so much I know Kung Fu, but I know AML, which I'm sure is kind of the dream. So one scenario is to move from something where you've got the kind of the front line above, you've got the regulators below, and the risk professionals in the middle. So please forgive my representation, but I'm hoping you're going to work with me. So if that represents the sort of the current structure that we have right now, where both sides are kind of coming to the risk professionals in the middle for assistance, for guidance as to what they should do, it becomes something much closer to what has been coined the democratization of expertise, meaning that there isn't just a relationship between the external regulator and the risk professionals and the front line and the risk professionals, but there's also another relationship between the external regulator and that front line through ChatGPT. So what that could or should mean is that risk professionals are used much more for the edge cases requiring that kind of judgment and insight that I talked about right at the beginning, which is this kind of thing that AI cannot do for you. But what it may well be able to do is to deal with all of that volume. So Hiro Maxim is one of my favorite inventors, because everybody should have a favorite inventor. He, about 40 years before the Wright brothers took off, he had the idea, he invented all of the necessary equipment to for a plane to fly, in terms of, you know, all of the wings and the ailerons and things like that. His big problem is that the internal combustion engine didn't exist at that time. It was only steam engines, and he couldn't find a steam engine light enough to place on the plane so that it could actually take off. So it was only when the internal combustion engine came along that the Wright brothers could do their thing, because it could be light enough to get off the ground for the 200 feet in North Carolina, I think it was. So my point being that sometimes you have to wait for the right tech to come along. Now, at this stage with generative AI, we are still at a very early stage. And it's a pretty good stage, right? It can do a lot, but it is early. We are at that kind of the famous photo of Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. That's their first Apple computer. When I talk about abstraction, I mean layers of interface that mean that people who aren't hobbyists, shall we call them, are the only ones who can use something. So we're moving towards that kind of idea of abstraction on the right-hand side, but we are very far away from it. And that represents, I believe, a massive opportunity. But overall, we are on a journey. We're moving from historical hindsight, being descriptive analytics that tells us what happens, what has happened, diagnostic analytics, which tells us why it happened, to something which is much more foresight and future facing, which is those predictive analytics that tells us what the future could look like, but perhaps most importantly, prescription, which tells us how we can make it happen. So if we have something like ChatGPT and it's across all the regulation and all of your 800-page books, it's something that you can then ask it. You can ask it scenarios. You can ask it scenarios about what if we did this transaction in Singapore, if it knows Singaporean regulations. So that's the kind of the overall journey that artificial intelligence is taking. There's no source on here. I should tell you, it came from Gartner. So what does that mean in terms of kind of what you might call the new risk world? I think it probably means that it's possible to become fully compliant. I'm not sure that's necessarily desirable for everybody, but I think it might be possible. I think it also might be possible to be fully mitigated, which I have to say is a phrase that I've never really used before. And I think it's probably the case. I'm not even, it may not be practical. But my point there is that if you do have the regulations in the hands of everybody who's actually kind of operationally using the regulations and responsible for the regulations on a daily basis, that should mean that they're able to mitigate everything that they're doing, the risks of everything, as far as is possible. Because the other point, of course, is that GPT can imagine new risks. And then the last point is opportunity. The frontline people should be able to say, well, if that's the regulation or if that's compliance, what else could I do? And in theory, GPT should be able to suggest things that you can do commercially and yet still be compliant. And obviously that has its good side and its not so good side, because everything that we're talking about here can be done with by the bad actors as much as it can for the good actors. There's something I came across recently called Jevons paradox, which is basically where something becomes so abundant, it's almost too cheap to meter, too cheap to measure. That can mean that you do so much more of it. So an example would be if we had abundant energy, cold fusion or something like that, there may be all sorts of things that we do, like vertical farming or water desalination, where we no longer care about the supply of energy, and therefore demand becomes more or less overwhelming. So I believe there is a possibility, I wouldn't call it a risk, but a possibility of Jevons paradox where generative AI and regulation is concerned. Because you can imagine, if a regulator knows that, never mind your 800 pages, it could be 3,000 pages. And it is perfectly possible for you to be compliant to all 3,000 pages, because we're no longer depending on compliance teams in order to do something about those. Now, it should be something that everybody in the organization has access to and should be able to be applied to every transaction that they're working on. So does that necessarily mean that I can now create as many regulations as I like? I can even audit the regulations on a regular basis because GPT will do that for me. Now, in terms of GPT, just like anything, there are risks. I thought this was a great list I got from a PwC document. Firstly, the data risks. You will have read about this in terms of you have to be very careful what you put into ChatGPT, because there is that real risk that it becomes a part of the model. But there are things that you can do, like you can write, you can define your email domain as something which is anything that comes from that email domain should not be included in training. And that's the very important thing to do. In terms of kind of the model itself, there can be biases built in depending how it's been trained, what facts have been used in order to train that thing. Thirdly, the prompt really matters. The prompt that somebody, your frontline person, is actually putting in, regardless of the corpus of data behind it, it really matters what it's been asked and how it's been asked it, which is the old problem of garbage in, garbage out. And then lastly, the user risks. I talked to you about Stephen Schwartz before, that, you know, people do have a habit of kind of copying and pasting stuff from ChatGPT as for their homework, and without removing the bit that says, I'm just ChatGPT, so I don't really know anything about anything, but here you go. So there can be significant user risks in terms of what people are likely to use it for. There's any number of other risks that are, or watch outs, but I'm not going to go through all of those right now. Those are, I think, PwC have done a great job of just kind of listing those main ones. So the last of my key messages, there are significant opportunities available to early adopters. Now, at the moment, we are in what Andreessen Horowitz has described as the first wave of generative, which is that we're taking a prompt and that results in long form responses like analyze this, imagine that, explain that. Where they believe this is going in terms of wave 2 is what they refer to as synthesis, which is where GPT will take in a variety of different inputs, and some of those can be live inputs. And from vast volumes of information, it can create insights, and you can see how this could be really important with things like credit reports or markets transactions, where the risks actually kind of change on a regular basis depending on what's happening in the market. We're not there yet. But that's where Andreessen Horowitz believes that we will be, and in short order, meaning it could be 6 months, it could be next year. So where do you start with all of this? Because I've been saying all the way through, it's important to kind of get going, right? And NFX have come up with a really nice set of models where they've got they define sort of 5 layers. The first one is general AI models like ChatGPT that you use in order for natural language, in order to kind of just talk to the system. And that's what we have at the moment. It's just a general model. It's not particularly good at anything, but it can have a go at answering anything from anesthetics to mortgage broking, right? Where things are moving to, and Bloomberg GPT is a great example of this, is specific AI models for specific areas. So what Bloomberg have done is to take their finance data and to create a GPT for finance professionals using all of that data. So now you can access that through natural language instead of having to build Excel formulae or code or any of those kind of things. Equally, Google have created a medical GPT, which is trained on medical Q&A, which has achieved an 85.4% pass mark for a medical exam, which is much better than the 60%, which is the pass mark for human doctors. GPT was at 50.2, so pretty good, but not as good as a model that's been trained specifically on medical data. Then there's a hyper-local model, and by that could well be your business, back to the 800-page documents and anything else that you want to train it with. So where a lot of people are going at the moment, and I think it's a really good idea, is to build their own GPT. And that's something that teams are doing, and there's specific apps that claim that they can help you to do that. The fourth layer is around operating systems and API layers like AutoGPT I talked about a little bit earlier. And these things called ChatGPT plugins, which I also, if you remember that kind of idea of the tunnel through to the Kayak and Expedia and things like that. There's also some really great apps which are available out there where you can upload a PDF, and that could be regulation, or it could be a credit report or anything like that, as a PDF. And then you can ask it questions. You can ask for a summary. You can ask it to explain specific concepts. You can look for patterns within a document. These are an example of the early plugins that they launched with back in March. There's, I think, 20 pages of them now. And as I said before, you can imagine with private GPTs, yes, there's Kayak and there's Expedia, But surely it's only a matter of time before the regulators produce their own and then expect everybody to be using them on a regular basis, because why wouldn't they? And then the last kind of layer, which we really haven't got to, it's that abstraction point that I said earlier, is applications that make it easy. So you're not just faced with that kind of letterbox. And Otter.ai is something that I use for meetings, which transcribes and summarizes meetings. I can send it to Zoom meetings that I don't have time to go to. And Otter is fantastic. And that, I think, is what we're going to be seeing increasingly, is those type of applications that use GPT, but make it easier for people to use it on a regular basis. In terms of kind of teaching yourself and knowing more, there are a couple of newsletters that I get on a daily basis at the moment, which are fantastic for keeping up with what's happening in the area, but also for teaching you prompts. One of them is Prompts Daily, which you should be able to get through with that QR code. And I'll leave it up there for a little bit longer, so you can use your phones if you want to. Again, don't forget, this will be in YouTube, so you'll be able to get access to that that way. But Prompts Daily is excellent. The second one is the Rundown. The Rundown is, I think it does include prompts, but it's more a daily news. And there is an awful lot which is going on in this area. New applications which are being launched all the time. Many of them are based on GPT, but they're much more specific in their application to areas like professional risk, for instance. And then lastly, I think there's a fantastic book by Reid Hoffman, who's one of the founders of LinkedIn, who had access to GPT for 6 months before the launch, I think, because he's an investor. And he's written this book, which is allegedly co-wrote with GPT-4, which basically means there's excerpts in it with GPT-4 are clearly written. But he talks about what he believes are the implications and future scenarios. And that's an excellent book. So in terms of my key messages, these are the things that I've gone through. I hope you agree with me that it should lead to better risk management. I think risk is one of those kind of areas where opportunities abound. I'm very optimistic about risk, but those bad actors, I think, are a real problem. And I do think there are significant opportunities. Key questions, I think, when I talk about the democratization of expertise and frontline people having kind of access to compliance in that way, that's easy to say. I think different organizations will be ready for that kind of democratization at different stages, different levels. So I'm not saying it's a panacea. That's something that your business needs to decide for itself. Secondly, I think there is a fundamental question here about what does this mean for the way that your firm manages risk, and perhaps the role of you and your team as a risk professional. Thirdly, what are the threats and immediate opportunities in terms of those bad actors? But lastly, and again, optimistically, what can you and AI now do together that you couldn't do before? In terms of Hero Maxim and his plane, that was the steam engine. Now you've got the internal combustion engine. What can you do differently? So in terms of kind of joining the revolution, and there's our last poll, something we can help you to think through is exactly what this could and should look like for you and your organization. We can help you to build a basic GPT, where we can take something like an 800 page manual and kind of build something around that and see how that works, and then run some pilots, because that's all you can do at the moment. This is moving so incredibly quickly. And so, you know, very much like a kind of a skipping rope in a playground, you just have to get in there. And I think that is the end. So if we were to go to questions, well, here we go. So the first one from Sunny Sethi, does ChatGPT remember conversations from across all channels or only from the same channel? Only from the same channel, I believe. And other places like Bing don't remember different things. Fang, how do you upload 800 pages of new risk legislation when the max input is about 3,000 words? That's a great question. If you remember that table I had where you had ChatGPT, there was Anthropic on the right-hand side, and their limit is 75,000 words. So that's where you would use that. From your opinions, how prepared, ready are we as the Australian economy to take on the challenge opportunity to incorporate AI in our compliance processes? Do you observe a sense of commitment and buy-in from management? You know what, I think that's a bit of an unfair question because we are really early. But that's why we're doing sessions like this, because we think there is a massive opportunity here for Australian business as a whole, to incorporate AI, and we'd love to be a part of that. But in terms of kind of, you know, are they ready? Well, I'm not sure anybody is, to be fair. While experimenting with ChatGPT, I've noticed it struggles to provide a basis for its answer or text. While dealing with regulators, you perceive this to be a challenge. Yeah, I think it is, although ChatGPT, when it's using the browser plugin, it's actually very good at, it gives you footnotes, and you can click on something and it will tell you what site it got those from. Equally, things like Perplexity, ever since it was created, has given you very specific sources that it's got the data from. So I think that means that the industry has clocked the fact that this is not okay, that it's just a black box and the world has to deal with that. So I think we're going to be seeing a lot more sort of UX stuff like that, that helps us to understand what the sources are. ChatGPT is only current to 2021 and all data uploaded becomes the property of ChatGPT. For a company, can they pay for a private service where data uploaded is not shared and still private? Yes, you can actually fill out a form that stops data from that email domain being used. And also you can turn off there's a little switch in settings where you can turn off the ability for your data to be used. So they have done that. Interested in your thoughts on how APRA and ASIC are looking at this technology. I have no idea. APRA and ASIC don't keep me updated. Can ChatGPT access data from a file that's in a Google Drive and gather data? That's a good question. I think not. I think if that was possible, the world would have been told by now, because I suspect that's illegal. What are the risks of AI listening embedded in software in relation to sensitive or client information and where the data is stored? I don't know. I've got Alexa in most rooms in my house. It's very welcome to listen to all the conversations I have, and I think they probably are, judging on the fact that I can talk about something and then the next day I'm seeing it in my Facebook feed. I think it's kind of, again, I think it's unlikely because I think people will get into real trouble, but who knows? Right, last question, I think, because it's 12:59. What are the risks of AI? No, I've done that one. The only way to quote sources from ChatGPT is when you add them yourself. Yeah, I think that's probably one way to say it. I think another way to say it is if it's your private GPT, then I think that obviously that's something which is just open to you, and it's based on the facts that you've given it, in which case I think that's different. Okay. Sorry, we only had time for those questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben, for that insightful lesson on embracing ChatGPT and AI in risk management.